So when we're thinking about the book of 1 Samuel, obviously we wrapped it up a little bit over a week ago. And so this morning we kind of want to do a little bit of a recap, basically to help us get in mind some of the major things that we talked about in 1 Samuel, but also help us prepare for our study of 2 Samuel. And I'll begin maybe with a couple of questions to sort of jog our memory. But if you recall, we talked about the book of 1 Samuel at the very beginning. And true or false, the book of Samuel was originally written as two different books. Is that true or false? That's false, right? We know that in our Bibles it's divided up into 1 and 2 Samuel, but that was not the case. Originally, these two books were written as were originally written as one book. The books of the Kings, the books of the Chronicles, those two books as well. Which there are four of them in our Bible, but Kings and Chronicles was originally one whole volume, and in our Bibles it's divided into two sections. Samuel was the exact same way. In our Bibles it's divided into 1 and 2 Samuel. Now, we recall that there are a lot of major themes in this book. We see over and over again how God delivers His people through righteous men, sometimes despite unrighteous men like Eli and his sons, where God has delivered His people on multiple occasions. We understand, we know that Saul's transition from good to bad king is covered in this book. And so when you think about 1 Samuel, a lot of times we think about, David and Goliath, which is probably David's most notable story. But 1 Samuel is a book that's primarily focused on the kingship of Saul. And that's how the book is divided, right? If you notice, 1 Samuel ends with the death of Saul. 2 Samuel begins basically with talking about how David will take the throne. And we'll see that it comes in stages because there's going to be some opposition to David. But 1 Samuel, even though we think about David and Goliath, the main emphasis in that book is on the lives of Samuel and Saul, preparing the way, getting David to the throne. Now, when you think about 1 Samuel in its entirety, there are a lot of transitions, there are a lot of changes. We've talked about how in a lot of ways there's a lot of comparisons made between Saul and David, and for good reason. Saul was a man that falls out of favor with God. David is a man that we see progressively through the book gains the favor of God, and we see how God is with him on multiple occasions in this book. Now we again think about what has just happened in this book. In 1 Samuel, where we left off, right? That last section we talked about one of the major questions, or at least a couple of the major questions, when David leaves Israel. When Saul drives him out in chapter 27, we talked about that a couple of the major questions there were, how did Israel fare when David left? And what did David do when he was out of Israel? And as we talked about, David, when he left Israel, things went downhill rather quickly. It went downhill for Saul. We saw that in chapter 28. He betrays his final moral righteous principle and goes and serves other gods, basically, by going and consulting the woman there in the city of Endor. David, on the other hand, we know that when he goes to Philistia, he continues to serve God, even to the point where the king of Gath recognized and called upon the very personal name of the God of the Jews because of the example that David had set for him. And so things are going progressively worse for Israel. Things are going progressively better for David, even though things are not great all the time, as we saw with the raids made against Ziklag, where David lost his wife. The men that were with David, they lost their wives, they lost their possessions and things of that nature. But we saw that how David and his men recovered that through the work of David. And there are a couple of maps that I want to point out to again help us remember what has just happened. We'll see if that works from here. I may have to step back. Let me go up here and turn those lights off real quick. So I'm going to sit down for a minute to get out of the way. But again, you're looking at a map of Israel. Let me grab my Bible to point some of these things out. So we know that when Saul died, right? Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 31. We know that Saul dies. He dies on Mount Gilboa, which is not labeled on the map, but we talked about the armies of Philistia in that chapter. They're encamped in Shunem. The armies of Israel, they're camped at Mount Gilboa, which is to the south of Jezreel. We know that that was the case. And not just the fact that Saul and his sons died, right? But if you look at, again, 1 Samuel 31, verse 7, when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. Well, what this map shows is what has happened to Saul and his sons, but not just that, but what has happened in Israel. See, this territory right here that Philistia is marching up, originally this territory basically from down here and over, that yellow territory, that belonged to the Israelites before what happened at Mount Gilboa. But now what we read there in the text, 1 Samuel 31, verse 7, these Israelites who have watched Saul and his sons perish and the army perish, they fled. They fled back perhaps to the east of Jordan, probably to the south. But this opens the door for Philistia, the Philistines, to move in and take this area. And so Israel has lost land in the north because of Saul's wickedness as a king. We know that Saul was punished, right, by God, as we saw in 1 Samuel 28. And they lose this territory. So in the northern part of Israel, things aren't going very well. But we talked about with David that when you looked at the southern portion of Israel, things are actually going a little bit better, right? In 1 Samuel 30, David went and took on the Amalekites. He defeated them. He recovered the spoils. And as we talked about, when David came back to his men, right, he gave to them their spoils. He gave to the men that had stayed back at the brook Besor, he gave to them their spoils as well. But we also talked about how David sent gifts back to the people of Judah. And if you look in your Bibles, 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 27 down through the end of the chapter, which ends at verse 31, right, you see a list of all of these cities here. And, this is a full map of Israel where David, Saul dies up here, David's down here at Ziklag and in this area, right, southern Israel. And this is another map of some of the cities of southern Israel. But basically, here's Hebron and everything farther south. All of these cities have benefited because of David. They have had possessions returned to them that David has taken back from the Amalekites, that the Amalekites had taken from the Israelites who lived in this city. And the point being is that while Saul and the Israelites are faring very poorly up here where they've lost territory, David, on the other hand, and his men, they've been winning things back for Israel, particularly southern Judah. So when you think about how this book ends, northern Israel, it's a little bit unstable. But because of Saul's wickedness, right, his punishment, northern Israel is a little bit unstable because of the Philistines. But in southern Israel, things are a lot more stable because of what David has done. And the importance of that is it sets up for 2 Samuel because, again, you're going to have a division about who's going to be the next king. We know that David was appointed to be the next king. But I don't have a map up here, but we'll see that in the first 5 chapters, David's basically going to be in control of this territory, the southern part of Israel. And one of Saul's sons is going to be in control of northern Israel. And the reason why that division takes place is because of what we have just seen. Saul and his men are basically stationed up here. David and his men are basically stationed down here. And we'll talk more about that when we get there, but it sort of helps prepare our minds for thinking about this. If you look on a map, where David is at his strongest, where Saul is at his strongest. And the one other thing that I will mention, right, and we've talked about this before, but part of the emphasis of this book, 1st and 2nd Samuel here, you're talking about how David becomes king, and that David became king because God designed it to be that way. Not because David was a man who lusted for the death of Saul. You know, David's not a man who was plotting Saul's death. Again, if you would turn in your Bibles, let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 16. Because this is a later point in David's life where Absalom again has revolted against David, right? Absalom, David's son. And David's, in the process of having to deal with this, having to deal with a rebellion in his own land. And let's look at 2 Samuel 16, beginning in verse 5. And when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, thou man of Belial. Right? What does that phrase mean, a man of Belial? He's a worthless man. Right? That was what, the sons of Eli, right? Hophni and Phinehas, right? They were called worthless men. Nabal was called a worthless man by his wife. And now here's the man of the house of Saul calling David the very same thing, even though David is the anointed one of the Lord, the king of Israel. Now notice what he says in verse 8, though. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned, and the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art fallen in thy mischief, because you are a bloody man. And that was his charge. That was perhaps some of the thinking of those of the house of Saul, right? That David had no right to be king because he was not of the lineage of Saul. His point there, Shimei's point, is that David, you took the throne through murder. You had to take advantage, or you were part of the plan behind Saul's death, and that allowed you to take the throne. And we've talked about in 1 Samuel how God has been helping David out along the way. We know in 1 Samuel 16 that it was said that God wanted to pick a successor to Saul, not of his own lineage, but of a man that was after God's own heart. And we know in that chapter, Samuel goes to the sons of Jesse, and it winds up being David is the one who's anointed by God to be the next king of Israel. We see in that latter half of 1 Samuel how Saul has fallen out of favor. David is in favor with God, and it all pointed to David being the rightful one to take the place of Saul when Saul died. So we know that David did not take the throne by plotting out the murder of Saul. But that's an important point that the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel gets across, right? David took the throne because he was appointed by God. David did not take the throne because he was out there plotting the murder of Saul. He was the rightful one to take the throne. Now, the reason why we point that out is in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we get further indication about why David was the rightful one to take the throne. And it's all going to be centered around how he responds to the news of Saul's death. In fact, when we break this chapter down, we'll start today, but we'll continue on in the next couple of weeks. We'll talk about the main focus in this chapter is the response to Saul's death. The response to Saul's death. And what we have in chapter 1 is actually a comparison. We talked about the comparisons between Saul and David, but what's being compared in this chapter is actually the response of this messenger to David who talks about the news of Saul's death versus David's own response to Saul's death. Because they have two very different reactions. And David's reaction is going to show that even in Saul's death, David was going to remain loyal to Saul, to the Lord's anointed. And we'll see that as it comes out in this chapter. But you think about for a moment, whenever we have problems with other people, and it can be whatever problem, right? They did something wrong to us. They did something wrong to our kids. Maybe they took a job promotion at work. Maybe they got something that we wanted and we didn't get it. And sometimes that can cause a rift between people. That can cause, problems between people. They don't like each other anymore. And sometimes whenever we deal with people that we don't like, we kind of enjoy it to see them fail, right? I'll say this because I'm a sports fan, but there are sports teams that I don't like. They're natural rivals to my teams. If you're an Atlanta Braves fan, you don't like to see the Phillies win because they're in your division. And sometimes as sports fans, you enjoy seeing your rivals lose. And that's because it's sports and things of that nature. But, in a more serious part, there are some people in life that enjoy seeing the suffering of others. You think about, and what comes to mind, you think about what just happened in Haiti a few weeks ago, right? The president died. There were a lot of people that were rejoicing in that. And the president of Haiti wasn't necessarily a great man, but, there are a lot of people that rejoice in seeing the downfall of another individual. And that's something that's true in the world, but sometimes that's true in the church. We're not always, we're supposed to get along within the congregation, but, sometimes we can say things that upset one another, right? And sometimes we can become at odds with one another. And things like that can happen. And sometimes if we're not careful, we allow our own hatred or our own selfish jealousy of someone else within a congregation. Sometimes we can allow that to cloud our judgment of the entire picture. If somebody who we don't like in the church, say this for instance, right? Say we have a problem with somebody in the church and say this problem's been going on for a couple of years. Well, say one day that they stop going to church. They have a problem in their life. Maybe it's a divorce. Maybe they have the death of a parent or kids. And they suddenly become unfaithful. They're no longer faithful to the church as they once were. If we had a problem with that brother or sister, in the back of our mind we could say, they got what they deserved. They got what was coming to them with the death of a parent or with some kind of tragic thing in life. And they're no longer part of the church. And in the back of our mind we may think to ourselves, we could tell that was coming. We could tell that person wasn't going to be faithful when things got tough. And sometimes we do that because maybe we don't like that particular brother or sister, and we have a problem with that. But that's not the attitude that we need to have, right? Because we recognize that we can have problems with other Christians, but whenever they struggle spiritually, whenever they abandon the church or things of that nature, that's not something that we rejoice in. That's something that we ought to be sad about. And David's going to get this point across here in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And we'll talk about this more in depth, but this is a good way to overview this chapter. You think about all the problems that Saul has caused David, right? It was Saul and his men that drove David out of Israel. You think about all the bad things that happened to David while he was out of Israel, right? Obviously, he loses his first wife, right? Saul took that from him. When Saul drives David out of the land, David loses his home, loses his family in a lot of ways, right? His family has to go on the run. When David is driven out of Israel, David has to go in to serve in the army of Israel's enemies. That's something that, David obviously took advantage of that opportunity to help out the Israelites, but that's probably not David's first choice, to serve with the Philistine army versus serving with the Israelite army. But Saul took that privilege away from him. You think about what has just happened at Ziklag, where David has lost his home there. It was burned down by the Amalekites. He lost his wives. He lost the loyalty of his men for a while, right? They were on the verge of killing him. They wanted to stone him because they were looking for somebody to blame. And you can trace all of those problems back to the result of Saul wanting David out of Israel, right? Saul was the motivator for all of that. You know, David's not in Ziklag if Saul had not forced him out of the land. You think about all the bad things that happened to David, all the reason why David had a motive to hate Saul and to rejoice in his death. But we're going to point out that David doesn't do that. David will not rejoice in Saul's death, despite all the personal harm that came upon David, because David's thinking about the larger picture here. When Saul died, David recognized that this, at the end of the day, hurt Israel. It hurt Israel because, let's go ahead and pull up the verses. Go ahead and go down to verse 4 for me. I don't have that on the PowerPoint. Verse 4. Right, go and we'll look at this a little bit more in detail next week. But notice in verse 4, right? Not only has Saul died, but notice also verse 4. David hears about what's happened. Not just Saul, but Jonathan and the other sons of Saul. Not all of his sons, but some of the other sons of Saul are dead. But Jonathan is included in that. You think about Jonathan. Jonathan was important to Israel, despite his father's problems. Jonathan was the one back in chapter 13 and 14 that helped deliver a great victory to the Israelites. That came by the hand of Jonathan and his servant. You think about how Jonathan has helped David out with getting away from Saul. Jonathan has been a great friend to David, as we see later in the chapter. Well, David recognized that despite my problems with Saul, Jonathan died in the process of this. A great man of Israel, a man who's done a lot for Israel, died in the process of this. We're going to see David's not so concerned about rejoicing because his mortal enemy is dead. He's going to be thinking about all the damage done because God's anointed has been killed. Jonathan, the righteous man, the righteous servant of Israel, is dead. You think about all the Israelites. When we go back and I'll step back. You think about all the Israelites, right, who've lost their homes, the Israelite soldiers who have died, right, fighting against the Philistines in Gilboa and Jezreel. Think about all of them. They've died, right? That was also delivered at the news of Saul's death. What's also delivered, right, the loss of homes, the loss of territories. The Israelites, they fled. Back over here, Israel has lost land. That's not something good. We know as well that one of the things that happened when the Philistines defeated the Israelites is that they used this to praise their gods. They did that with Samson, right? Remember in the book of Judges, they took Samson, they made a mockery of him. They praised their gods because they had captured Samson. We saw in 1 Samuel 4 when the Ark of the Covenant was captured, right? The Philistines rejoiced about that. They took the Ark, they put it in their temple, and they put it on a shelf that was below their God because they were giving their gods the credit. David understood that the name of God was made a mockery because of the Israelites' failure to win here. And I bring all of that up because you think about, again, we don't rejoice when other people suffer. David, apart from Jesus, perhaps there's no individual in the Bible that had more reason to rejoice in one person's death than David did for Saul. But David did not let his personal problems with Saul cloud the fact that this was a bad day for Israel. And it's not a day for rejoicing because Jonathan has died, because a lot of Israelite soldiers have died, because a lot of Israelites have lost their home, because the name of God has been mocked. David understood that this was not a joyous occasion. And we'll talk about more as we get into that next week, about why David, again, will point that out. But that is something for us to think about when hopefully we read over this chapter maybe in the next week. But when you read this chapter, you think about that idea. We have problems with those in the congregation. And really anybody. We never want to see them fail. We never want to see them suffer tragic things in life because it can have greater repercussions. David understood that, and we'll point that out as we move forward. But are there any comments that you would like to add on to what we've talked about today, or maybe any closing thoughts on what we talked about in 1 Samuel?
It'd be great if that principle you expressed so well could be applied in all areas, even in I hate to bring up political areas, but it seems like when one party's president gets in, the other party hopes he does bad, and vice versa. Whereas the country's greater than any party or movement, and whoever's in the office, you want to pray for him and hope and pray he does well because of the good of the country. Just because my group lost, well, I'm more concerned about the country than my group.
Right.
So that can apply to so many areas like this.
Right. Absolutely. That reminds me. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this story, but when if you recall back in 1992, George H.W. Bush ran for president, ran for a second term. He didn't win it, right? Bill Clinton became president. And I don't remember the exact contents of the letter, but and you can go back and read the exact contents if you look this up. But when President H.W. Bush left office, and when he was packing his stuff up, leaving office, and opening the door for Clinton to move into the White House, he left behind a letter that was addressed specifically to Bill Clinton. And he talked about in that letter, even though that they didn't see eye to eye, President H.W. Bush said, "There's no bigger fan of you than me," because he understood that the fate of the country rested on what Bill Clinton did, right, for the next 4 years and eventually the next 8 years, right, because he won a second term. But President H.W. Bush ran against Clinton. He was his enemy in that campaign. But at the end of the day, despite their differences, President H.W. Bush recognized that, I'm praying for you. I'm hoping you do well because that means that our country's doing well. That means that I benefit as well. And that's a very good point to think about. That's a very good point in politics to think about. We don't want to see other people fail. Even though it might bring us personal satisfaction, it could also mean that, there are a lot of other people that suffer because of one man's failure. And we'll go ahead and stop here because I'm going to need to move some of this to set up for a moment. But if there are no other comments, we'll sort of begin looking at 2 Samuel 1, get involved with the text next week. But we kind of just wanted to do a summary to get us prepared for this book. But we will pick up there next week. Thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.